Hello and welcome to the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. We bring you interviews from people who have conquered the trickiest of health challenges using the functional diagnostic nutrition philosophy and similar healing modalities. You're going to hear from experts who have been through the ringer with their health issues and yet managed to come out on the other side. You can always visit us at functionaldiagnosticnutrition.com, but for now, here is today's episode. All right. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. My name is Evan Transu, aka Detective Ev, and I will be your host for today's show, episode number 372 of the Health Detective Podcast. And we got a fun one for you guys. So we kind of announced this a couple of weeks ago, but I just want to specify this so this isn't confusing, especially if you're an audio-only listener. This will make a lot more sense, although I definitely recommend if you are on audio, click the link in the show notes, get the YouTube version of this, and save it for when you can sit down, because you'll understand why in just a second. So what Lucy McKellar, the executive director of the Association of Functional Diagnostic Nutrition Professionals, and I have done for the last, 20 or 22 weeks here, is we did something called Lunch&Learn. So Lunch&Learn is where we've taken some of the concepts of the FDN course, we've broken them down in such a way that we're not, just giving away the FDN course, but also making it so that if you're not a sciencey person, but you want to learn this stuff, you can kind of, learn more about FDN. But we also realize we have people in this space that are very sciencey and love to nerd out. And so we were like, how can we give you guys something more? And if you didn't realize what we were doing, we were testing the waters. So we had Dr. Aaron Gonshore on to go over the metabolic wellness profile. You guys loved that. We recently had Paula Reed on to go over the Dutch test. You absolutely loved that. And so we have now created 2 out of the 4 episodes of Lunch&Learn that are done each month are now going to be Lab&Learn. So it's not a separate series. It's more just a play on words. So that you know that we're going to be nerding out on those days. So you can stick with us for the Lunch&Learns. If you prefer the simpler stuff, Lucy and I have you covered. If you'd like the more advanced stuff, we got people like our guest today that can really help you understand some nice nerdy lab concepts. So her name is Whitney Morgan. She's been on a couple of times before. I'll read her bio and we will get into this. Whitney Morgan is the founder of Morgan Nutrition, the creator of the Thyroid Reboot Method, and a co-founder of the Functional Health Alliance. Specializing in advanced functional testing and root cause healing, Whitney focuses on helping women with thyroid issues, including Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism, to identify and eliminate their unique triggers and restore vibrant health. In addition to being a licensed acupuncturist, a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, a primal health coach, and a certified gluten-free health coach, Whitney is currently enrolled at the Institute for Functional Medicine and expects to complete her certification in 2025. And last but not least, she also serves as a clinical advisor and instructor for the Association of FDN practitioners. And so remember, these are the people that we get to go to when we need help with a tricky case. So just think about that as you're listening to her today. Whitney, I've used you many times, so it's great to have you on the show again.
Thanks, Evan. It's great to be here.
Cool. So we'll spare everyone of the story side today, not because your story's not amazing. It's actually one of my favorites. It's because you guys can go check that out later. Whitney was like episode number 4 on this podcast. So we do have all of those available on audio. If you'd like to hear her story with celiac disease and other autoimmune things, it's a really cool one. Go check that out after. But today we're going to be breaking down 2 tests, the GI map and the wheat zoomer. Now, the GI map is one of our foundational labs. So this is something you'll learn about fairly extensively if you are to go through the FDN course. The wheat zoomer, while it's not one of our foundational labs, I just wanted to help these guys kind of preface this here.
Sure.
It's not a foundational lab, but it's something that Reed saw being useful enough that he's like, hey, Whitney, why don't we put something in the course for our trainees to learn about this? So since this isn't a core foundational lab, how do you view the wheat zoomer before we dive into the data on it?
Sure. That's a good question. Well, I tend to think in terms of foundational areas of investigation.
Sure.
Right? So this definitely covers an area of investigation. And in the world of autoimmunity and systemic inflammatory illnesses, gluten is such a common trigger, wheat and gluten both. And we can't rely on symptoms alone to let folks know that they have an issue. So it's to me, it's like if you don't run the wheat zoomer particularly for your autoimmune folks, you've got a huge blind spot because you don't know their level of exposure and their level of inflammatory reaction to it.
Awesome. And then just to be clear, so the labs that we're going to go over today are actually relating to the same person, client,
Yes.
if you will. Cool.
Yes.
And remember, one of the things that you'll pick up from our clinical advisors, because they're so well versed in this, is we're never treating the paperwork. You won't find them doing that. We're looking at the results, that matters, but we're always going back to the person that is in front of us, whether that's literally or virtually as practitioners. So I will bring your share screen on here. And again, if you
Awesome.
are on audio, go to the show notes, click the YouTube version, because we try to do our best to make these digestible on audio, but the Lab and Learns are going to be ones that you want to catch. So I will get your screen up here and
Excellent.
everything fine. So what are we starting with?
All right. So this is a female client in her 40s. She has Hashimoto's. She also has psoriasis. She's currently taking Skyrizi, which is an immune suppressor, right, for the psoriasis. She deals with fatigue and gas and bloating. She's on levothyroxine as well for the Hashis. So she came to me because she's been kind of in this space of throwing a lot of different things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And she finally got to a point where she said, you know, I need a plan. I need concentrated coaching. I need some lab testing. I need to get to the bottom of why I'm having these autoimmune issues. So because she has Hashimoto's and psoriasis, so that's two autoimmune diseases, right? And in my experience, particularly women, they tend to be autoimmune collectors. Where there's one, there's usually another one cooking, or maybe another two, right? And there is a strong correlation between Hashimoto's and celiac disease. Not that everyone who has Hashimoto's has celiac disease, but most celiac patients end up developing Hashimoto's. So, for that reason alone, it's important to assess someone's reaction not only to wheat and gluten but also kind of get the sense of what their risk factor is for celiac disease. One of the reasons why I love the wheat zoomer is because you can add on the celiac genetics, so you can get that information, and it also includes a couple of panels in it that are specific to celiac disease. So you can see that this client does have one of the genes specific for celiac disease, so she has an increased risk of developing celiac disease at any point in the future, right? And usually the genetics alone is not enough. You need some sort of a trigger to kind of send you over the edge, right? To get that gene to express. But the risk factor is there. So that is definitely significant for someone with two autoimmune issues. So let's take a peek at what else we've got here. Because she's on Skyrizi, and this is another option you can add to the wheat zoomer. It's free, but you have to ask for it. I want to assess her total immune function, right? So I'm looking at total IgA, IgG, IgE, and IgM. These are the different aspects of the immune response system. I'm looking for immune suppression, right? The good news is that she actually decided to hold off on her Skyrizi injection and do it 2 weeks late. So we were like as far away from her previous injection as possible. And that's where we did the blood draw, right? So we timed it, I think, perfectly. And it's great because all of her immunoglobulins are in the control range. So we have immune sufficiency, which is important to validate the rest of the results. Because if someone has suppressed immune function, then their antibody response is going to be suppressed as well. And you may be dealing with a bunch of false negatives. Okay. When it comes to food sensitivities, we're mostly concerned with IgA and IgG. So let's look at the actual wheat zoomer. So this is the summary. And Vibrant gives you a couple of scores here at the top of the page. We have an overall wheat zoomer score. You can see she's deep in the red, an intestinal permeability score in the red. So just looking at these two bars alone, I know, okay, this person has some exposure and reaction to the peptides of wheat, and she's got a leaky gut. Now, the cool thing about the wheat zoomer is it takes the whole wheat protein and it breaks it up into all of its little puzzle pieces called peptides. So you have the gluten peptides, you have the lectin, which is wheat germ agglutinin, and you have the non-gluten wheat peptides. So all of these peptides, I think of them as puzzle pieces. They are unique and they take a unique antibody response. So we're actually looking for exposure and reaction to the puzzle pieces of wheat and gluten rather than the big, clunky, large proteins themselves, right? So that makes the test far more sensitive and more specific. So you can see here that we're looking at both IgA and IgG. Now, IgA, these immunoglobulins are like first responders. They're quick on the scene, quick off the scene. We're less likely to catch IgA reactions on a wheat zoomer just because their half-life is about 3 to 6 days in the bloodstream. But with IgG, these immunoglobulins they're slower to form and they hang out in the bloodstream for a couple of months. So we're more likely to catch these reactions, right? But we look for both. And you can see that she has a lot of IgG reactivity to various parts of the wheat and gluten protein. But rather than talk about it here, I want to go to the individual panels. All right. So the first thing that they tell us, they do an IgE reaction to wheat. IgE, we're not really concerned with that aspect of the immune system. That's more your anaphylactic response, a legitimate allergy. Most people who run a wheat zoomer, they're going to show up negative for IgE reactions to wheat. That's pretty standard. The wheat zoomer also looks at zonulin levels in the gut. Zonulin, some of you might already be familiar with this. This is a common thing that we look at to assess gut permeability. It's an enzyme that increases in response to gluten, also in response to some endotoxins from gram-negative bacteria. And when zonulin is high, those tight junctions in between the cells that line the gut, they get dysregulated and damaged, and you've got leaky gut, right? So we see here that her zonulin level is high. Now, zonulin alone is not the most reliable marker for leaky gut because it changes really quickly in the bloodstream. So what you really want to look at are antibodies to zonulin, and we're going to look at that as well. But we actually caught high zonulin for her. So we know at the time of taking this test, yes, her gut was leaky. Now, these first two panels, these are the celiac panels. 9 times out of 10, these are going to be negative on a wheat zoomer. But I have actually caught a couple of what we call silent celiacs, people who had positive panels, both of the celiac panel and this complex panel, which are specific for celiac disease. And they had no clue. They didn't have the traditional celiac presentation when they ate gluten, right? They had other extra intestinal symptoms like panic attacks and other autoimmune diagnoses, right? So every once in a blue moon, you might catch someone who has silent celiac disease. So be prepared for that if you run it. All right. We have an intestinal permeability panel. And this is nice because it's looking for not just zonulin, but the antibodies to zonulin, the antibodies to actin, and to lipopolysaccharides. These are 3 ways that we assess gut integrity. Zonulin, like I said, will dysregulate those tight junctions that are in between each of the cells, like little gateways. Actin provides some structural support for the cells themselves. So if you have antibodies to actin, that's an indicator that there is damage to the actual cells that line the gut. So not just the tight junctions are damaged, not just the gateways, but the cells themselves. So we know here that she has damage to both, right? Which tells us she's getting some leakage around the cells, paracellular, so through those tight junctions, and through the cells themselves, so transcellular as well. So official leaky gut. In addition to that, she also has antibodies to lipopolysaccharides. These are toxins that are produced by gram-negative bacteria in the gut. So this is like a big clue for her microbiome. When I see this before I have like a stool test result, I'm immediately thinking about bacterial dysbiosis and overgrowth, that something is going on, that we're going to have to go after probably with some antimicrobials. But regardless, she's got these endotoxins. They've gotten through the gut lining into the bloodstream. LPS can be Well, pretty hazardous systemically because it can be a trigger for autoimmune disease. It can cause a lot of inflammatory cascades, inflammatory cytokines throughout the body, and it can shut down some detoxification pathways. It actually kind of closes some of these transporters, protein transporters in the cells, and toxins will build up in the cells and then backflush into the system. So you can feel pretty sick when you've got a lot of LPS toxicity. So this is a very leaky gut. Then we have the transglutaminase panel. This is not anything having to do with wheat and gluten specifically. This is a screening panel because transglutaminase 3 is a reparative enzyme that is highly localized in the skin. Transglutaminase 6 is localized in the brain. So if you have antibodies to either of these proteins, that can be a red flag for autoimmune progression going on at the skin or in the brain, which is not uncommon if you have celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So it's just a nice little added bonus that you have this one screening panel for autoimmune issues. All right, now we're getting into the nitty gritty. So, like I said, we're looking at the puzzle pieces of wheat and gluten. And the first puzzle piece we're looking at is wheat germ agglutinin. Now, she is reactive to it, so we know it's gotten through the gut lining, it's gotten into the bloodstream. The thing about wheat germ is that when it gets into the bloodstream, it can attach to almost every tissue in the body except two. So when it does, it's a very sticky little protein. And when it attaches and the immune system sees that it's attached to an organ or a tissue where it doesn't belong, the immune system will attack it. And then the surrounding tissue will get destroyed in the process. And that's what we call autoimmune disease by collateral damage. This is a very common phenomenon that happens with Hashimoto's. Wheat germ loves the thyroid. It goes to the thyroid, it lodges there, and the immune system damages the thyroid in an effort to protect you against the wheat germ. Okay. So when wheat germ shows up in the bloodstream, that's an automatic red flag for an increased risk for autoimmune issues. All right, now we've got the gluten peptides. So there's two panels here, the gliadin panel and the glutenin panel. You take all of these individual puzzle pieces, you put them together, you've got the big clunky gluten protein. And you can see that she's pretty reactive. She's got alpha gliadin, gamma gliadin, gluteomorphin, protonorphin, and the low molecular weight glutenin. So she's been exposed to multiple puzzle pieces of gluten, and she's had a pretty high immune activation because of it. Now, we don't diagnose in functional diagnostic nutrition. That's not what we do in FDN, but this is a pattern that is consistent with non celiac gluten sensitivity. Okay. Then we have all of the non gluten proteins as well. These are the wheat proteins. Right. So a lot of folks really focus on gluten. I mean, that's kind of in our zeitgeist. People are gluten free or they're gluten intolerant. Everyone's purchasing certified gluten free foods, and that's all great. But you can be wheat sensitive and gluten sensitive, and they're not the same thing. So one thing I always mention to my clients is that, there are some health food products out there that are very popular that are certified gluten-free, but they contain wheatgrass. Well, 95% of people who are gluten sensitive are also sensitive to the non-gluten parts of wheat. You can't take these puzzle pieces out of wheatgrass, right? You can't take the wheat germ out of wheatgrass. You can extract the gluten and make it as gluten free as possible, but you just can't take the wheat out of wheatgrass. So that's just kind of a caution for folks who are listening. Look at whatever green drink that you're putting in your smoothie, any green powder. If it's got wheatgrass on it and you're gluten sensitive, you might want to switch to something else. Okay, so what does this tell me about her? Well, I know she's got Hashimoto's. I know she has psoriasis. She's she's been avoiding gluten as best as she can, but she lives with her husband and her 2 kids. Gluten is still coming into the home. It's still being prepared in the kitchen. It's just that she's not eating those things, right? She's making separate meals for herself, but she's sharing that space. This is a pretty common result that I see with my clients like that, particularly moms who just kind of try and put this gluten-free bubble around themselves and let everybody else go about their lives. They don't want to disrupt anybody else's diet, but they tend to show up like this on paper. And the reason is because gluten can really hang out in a lot of places in our kitchen, cutting boards, wooden spoons, all kinds of shared utensils, and just in our pantry as well. So what ends up happening is that even if you're trying as hard as you can to avoid the wheat and the gluten, you tend to end up getting exposed, these nano exposures. They might not be large enough exposures to make you feel bad, 1 to 3 days later, but they're large enough to elicit an immune response and to exacerbate any sort of autoimmune processes that are going on. Um, should I pause, Evan, at this point and see if there's any questions?
I
Or
could listen to you talk all day, so I was like, "Oh my god, that's so good." I always pick up something every time, or I'll remember from, like, the last time we did something, I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I forgot that about wheat germ." This was, that was one that just rang in my head. So, I see about 30 of you live, which is awesome, and you guys are always, like, super polite. I always have to, like, invite them in. If you would like to ask questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Keeping in mind, we do try to, keep this timely. We're not gonna
yeah.
keep you guys for 2 hours today. We also are going to go over a GI map, so keep that in
Hmm.
mind as well. So I might have to pick from some of the questions that I don't want to call them better ones. That's not what I'm going to say. I'm
Yeah.
going to say from questions that I believe would serve the most amount of people and that are most relevant to what we're talking about. So please feel free to start dropping them in the chat and we can go back to it. But Whitney, other than that, we are good to go. And
Okay.
I just always appreciate you showing this stuff because I think people, you're right. We get into this space and gluten free is like par for the course. It's one of the
Yeah.
first things we learn about, but they don't understand what it takes to go gluten free.
Yeah.
And every time I've talked to you, you're not fear mongering. That's not what she's saying, guys. It's like, if you're going to do this, do it because,
Right.
being gluten free, except for, 2 weekends out of the month, it's like, well, you might as well, I shouldn't say it this loosely, but you almost might as well just not do it at all. And
Yeah.
it's not to say that you're not getting a worse response by doing it every day. That's silly. But I think people, when they dedicate themselves to natural health and holistic healing, you want to make sure you're doing it correctly. And if
Hmm.
you understood the immune responses and how long they last when you
Yeah.
expose yourself to this, you would probably never eat this intentionally ever again. I've
Yeah.
been going 7, 8 years strong. I'm sure I've made some mistakes here and there, but I'm definitely better off because of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point because these antibodies, like I said, the IgG antibodies will hang out in the bloodstream for a couple of months. So if you have a little bit of gluten, in January, and then again in March, and then again, it's like some people are like, oh, I had a little bit for my birthday, I had a little bit at Thanksgiving, I had
Mhm.
these special occasions. Well, you can kind of keep yourself consistently inflamed, looking like this on paper, just by doing that every couple of months, right?
Yes.
And also, one thing before we switch to the GI map, one thing to remember about gluten is that you don't have to be sensitive to gluten for it to cause a leaky gut. It kind of causes a leaky gut in everybody. It raises those zonulin levels in everyone. Zonulin will dysregulate those tight junctions. That's just how it goes, right? So, leaky gut is the gateway to autoimmune issues. That's like one of those dominoes that has to fall. Once you have a leaky gut, I already told you about the WGA, the wheat germ agglutinin, that can get into the bloodstream and attach to a tissue, causing autoimmune issues. But also, gluten itself has molecular mimicry with thyroid tissue. So in my niche, I work with mostly women with thyroid issues. That's super important. So even if you're not going to test yourself for gluten sensitivity, if you've been diagnosed with Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism, just statistically speaking, you should stop consuming wheat and gluten because there's just too many ways for it to screw with your thyroid for you to continue to eat it. So that's my soapbox.
You'd be. I'm sorry. We might be able to do this back and forth, so I should be
Yeah.
careful here. But you'd be so happy to hear this. So, my mom, who did get a full thyroidectomy before we knew about this stuff, this was like in 2012 that she did this, 2013. She still, of course, goes to endocrinologists, stays up
Mhm.
to date on everything, and she started going to Penn Medicine because we live in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So, for those that don't know, that's just the hospital that's attached to University of Penn, so pretty
Yeah.
prestigious university. And she couldn't believe it, but this was 2, 3 years ago now when she went down there and she got this new doc down there. The woman was asking her, "Are you gluten free?" So this is a conventional MD,
Mhm.
yes, at a very good hospital. I get that, but that is not. She's not osteopathic. She's not functional. That's for sure. And was still taking the
Yeah.
time to make sure that my mom, as a Graves patient, so not even Hashimoto's, but as a Graves
Yes.
patient, was gluten free still. And I just think it's so cool to see how far this is coming. And it shows, I think anyone that listens to you knows this is not hippie science. Obviously, you're very intelligent and well read, but it's like, this is not theory, guys. This is actually harming people and
Yeah.
a huge contributing factor to the autoimmune epidemic, if you will, that we're seeing, namely in countries that eat stuff like this. What a surprise
Yeah.
that that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And for this client in particular, the fact that she has two autoimmune issues, right? And that she's continuing to be exposed to wheat and gluten in her home, and she's having this significant immune activation. And on top of that, keeping her gut leaky, that increases her risk of collecting an additional autoimmune disease down the road, right? Because this doesn't really stop once you're on that train, right? It's a snowball. So what we want to do is turn the ship around, right? And the only way to do that is to get rid of the trigger, get rid of the wheat and gluten, and heal the leaky gut. But because the gluten is so um, such a chaos agent in the gut, I think it's critical to also run a stool test, right? We saw the elevated lipopolysaccharides. So we know she's got endotoxins from gram negative bacteria. We know she's got leaky gut. So we have to ask ourselves, what's going on in that terrain? That's a whole ecosystem, right? We need to correlate with the stool. So let me bring up the GI map. The GI map, this is definitely one of our foundational labs. So this is great. It's a DNA PCR test. It's very sensitive. There is no perfect stool test out there. There's always going to be a few blind spots here and there. You're always going to run the risk of not catching everything you possibly can, but it's better than not testing, right? We don't want to guess when it comes to microbiome health. So this first page, this is looking at all the things that are commonly pathogenic, right? So things that would wind you up in the emergency room or urgent care. You'd be calling in sick to work, right? Think of traveler's diarrhea, think of stomach flu, those kinds of things. Most GI map results that you're going to get, that you're going to see, this first page is going to look totally normal. Everything below the detectable limit. Every once in a while, I'll see Giardia pop up or C. diff pop up, but usually it's blank. Okay. So the next thing we look at is H. pylori. So we're looking for bacteria, we're looking for parasites, we're looking for yeast, and we're also looking to evaluate the balance of the commensal flora or the healthy gut flora. Now, H. pylori, she has an H. pylori infection. Okay. She's definitely acutely elevated here. This is a common infection, it's a known Hashimoto's trigger. And this client struggles to get her antibodies under control. Her TPO antibodies are always somewhere between like 160 and 300, no matter what she does. And this might be one of the reasons why. This will trigger a Hashi's flare and raise the TPO antibodies. And the thing about H. pylori is that 50% of the population is positive at any given time, and many people are asymptomatic. And particularly, between partners or family members, we're swapping it back and forth. It's highly contagious. So it's very common to see people with H. pylori infections. So just right out of the gate, we've identified one potential Hashimoto's trigger and one agent of dysbiosis in her gut, right? All right. Then we look at commensal flora. So she has what I would call a mixed dysbiotic pattern. The first thing I look at are the bacterial phyla. These are the two largest families of bacteria. in the microbiome. They comprise about 90% of the microbiome. So we look at these two together, the Bacteroidetes and the Firmicutes, because it provides a really good snapshot into overall balance. And you can see the Firmicutes is low. She's depleted in gram-positive healthy flora, and she's elevated in the gram-negative commensal bacteria, right? So we've got this pretty extreme imbalance right out of the gate. And then the section above that, these are all of the strains, the keystone strains that we consider more clinically relevant when it comes to things like keeping inflammation in check or protecting gut integrity, right? Or just providing control for other opportunistic bacteria, right? Our commensal flora is part of our protection for these other organisms to get out of control. So when we have insufficiencies of certain keystone strains or elevations of others, particularly in Enterococcus and Escherichia, which she does here, she's got elevations of both, then we can expect to see a lot of opportunistic overgrowth on the next page, and we're going to see that. So this pattern is very dysbiotic, but it's mixed dysbiotic. Some are high, some are low. But it's a very common pattern to see when there's a lot of other dysbiosis that's present. So I know that we have to support some of her commensal flora, but there's also an aspect of her commensal flora that is actually elevated and a little overcrowded. So she is not a candidate for aggressive reinoculation, right? She's someone that actually needs antimicrobials. And we're going to see that on the next page. So this is a lot of red. Okay, this is someone who's just got this, and probably due to part of the gluten issue and the leaky gut and the H. pylori. One of the common causes of H. pylori is chronically low stomach acid, right? And stomach acid is kind of our primary defense against some of the organisms that we ingest with our food, right? It makes that acidic protective environment, kills a lot of stuff in the stomach. When you don't have enough of it, you're prone to H. pylori and you're prone to a lot of bacterial overgrowth. And we're certainly seeing that here. She deals with gas and bloating. She's got these consistent GI complaints. And many of these organisms, not only do they produce, some of them produce those lipopolysaccharides that we saw on her wheat zoomer, but they also produce a lot of gas and GI distress. And then she also has a few that are known autoimmune triggers for autoimmune disease in general, but Klebsiella specifically is a Hashi's trigger. So is Citrobacter. Now, her Citrobacter isn't elevated, but it is measurable. And when we're looking at these test results, well, when I'm looking at them, I'm not really looking at each individual marker. It's not a transactional process. It's more of a pattern. I'm looking for patterns, right? And she has a pattern of extreme opportunistic overgrowth with autoimmune triggers getting out of control, and she has two autoimmune diseases. So in the world of correlation, that is very meaningful. You put H. pylori in the mix with that, we have a lot of work that we can do, right? We get rid of these guys. If we knock down the Klebsiella, we eliminate the H. pylori, we eliminate the Proteus and even the Citrobacter, she's probably going to feel a lot better, and we're probably going to see those TPO antibodies coming down. Okay. Let's see here. She had no viruses, no parasites. That's great. The last section on the GI map is intestinal health markers, where we are assessing some immune function, inflammation, digestion, digestive capacity. So the first section, we're looking at steatocrit and elastase. Steatocrit is looking at how much fat is in the stool. We want it to be below the detectable limit. For her, it is. So that just tells me that, whatever her dietary fat intake is, her digestion is dealing with fat just fine. However, her elastase is extraordinarily low. Anything below 200 is pancreatic insufficiency, which tells me, yes, she has very low stomach acid and she has poor pancreatic enzyme production. So this is someone who isn't breaking down her food. So even if she's eating a whole food, nutrient dense diet, If she doesn't have the digestive power to deal with all of those nutrients and to break them down, she's going to be more prone to gut inflammation, more prone to leaky gut, and more prone to opportunistic overgrowth, right? Because the more of these larger, partially digested proteins spend a lot of time hanging out in the GI tract, it feeds a lot of those opportunistic bacterial organisms. So that was all that red we saw on the previous page. So we know that her digestion needs a lot of support. The GI markers, beta glucuronidase gives us some great insight into detoxification. Her beta glucuronidase looks fine, so there's nothing to see there. The occult blood, we always look for occult blood. You want to rule out any bleeding in the GI tract. If it comes back elevated, it's an automatic referral out to an MD. They have to be assessed. But she looks good here. In her immune response, we're looking at secretory IgA, which is our first chemical defense system in our gut. This is, this protects us from not just like bad guys like parasites and things, but it protects us from herbicides and pesticides and heavy metals and anything coming in to the system. This is our first chemical defense immune response. So we want it to be robust. Hers is. I'm actually surprised with the level of opportunistic overgrowth that she has such a strong secretory IgA, but that's good news for her. That means that she's in a much more resilient position than if she had low SIG-A. Now, this anti-gliadin, this is interesting, and sometimes I'll speak to other FDN practitioners during our clinical advising sessions, and they we're talking about a GI map, and they say, "Oh, well, this is great. Her anti-gliadin is normal. That means that she doesn't have gluten sensitivity." No, 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 no. It's not. The only time the anti-gliadin on the GI map is relevant is when it's elevated. When it looks normal, it's a non-clue. It doesn't mean anything. Basically, you have to catch the perfect sample at the perfect time to catch these IgA antibodies to this one particular gluten peptide. And we already saw on her wheat zoomer that she's got wicked exposure, wicked reaction, right? But she has this normal biomarker in her stool. So that just shows you how irrelevant this anti-gliadin is in a stool test when it looks normal. When it's elevated, you can trust it, but not when it's normal. Okay, the eosinophil activation protein, I would expect for this to be normal on her. This is an inflammatory marker. It's usually elevated in the presence of parasites or legitimate food allergies. She doesn't have either. She has a food sensitivity, but not allergies. And we didn't identify a parasite. So I would expect this inflammatory marker to be normal. The calprotectin, this is another way we assess inflammation in the gut. It's mostly specific for inflammatory bowel disease. We don't worry about calprotectin until it gets above 50. If it were legitimately elevated above 173, you would refer out to a GI doc or just their general practitioner for further assessment for inflammatory bowel disease. But the takeaway for this client is that this correlates perfectly, right? She's got a real leaky gut. We saw those endotoxins on the wheat zoomer. Now we see where all those endotoxins are coming from, which is all this opportunistic overgrowth of the bacteria and the H. pylori, right? And so we've got these triggers. Gluten is a trigger. The wheat germ is a trigger. H. pylori is a trigger. So is the Klebsiella. So is the leaky gut. So we have, a short list of 5 things to work on for her to get those TPO antibodies down, to get a remission of her Hashimoto symptoms and her psoriasis, because her goal is to get off the Skyrizi completely because she understands what it's doing to her immune system and she doesn't want to have to rely on it anymore. So that's a good pause point. Yeah, Evan, to kind of dig in to see if there's any questions.
Yes, absolutely. And they did this the last time too. You guys are so funny because this is one of our most watched segments once again. So I'm glad that we're doing these lab and learns. And then they wait. I don't know if you guys are just waiting for us to finish or you're waiting because you're scared. There's no wrong questions except this one. This is a wrong question. Please do not ask Whitney right now about your personal health challenges. At least be smart enough to word it in the third person or something, but do not ask about personal health challenges. That would be Not a wrong question, just certainly not the right one. Any questions about the case would definitely be great. In the meantime, though, because I know that this is a lot for people, especially if they were just clicking in, maybe they're scrolling on
Yeah.
YouTube right now and they find this, they're like, "Holy cow, this is a lot." I was just trying to drive to, soccer practice or whatever. Where can they find you, Whitney? Because you're not just a clinical advisor here; you are someone that people can work with. You take clients, and I would love if you could shout out where they can find you, because I'm sure there's going to be someone that listens that said, "All right, that person's pretty sharp. I'd like to get to know them."
Sure. Yeah, you can find me at Whitney Morgan Nutrition. That's my website. That's all my social media, my YouTube channel, Whitney Morgan Nutrition. Pretty simple.
I think it is. You said Whitney Morgan Nutrition, not Morgan Nutrition, right?
Well, you can do either. Morgan
Oh, okay,
Nutrition
perfect.
will get
Just
you
making
there
sure.
too. Yeah.
Just wanted to
Yeah.
make sure that works. All
Yeah.
right, so we will leave that up. Thank you, Tracy. I'm going to shout out something else, but we don't have to share that on the screen. If you guys are interested in these topics of autoimmunity and hypothyroidism, and you want to dive even nerdier with us, we have a workshop tomorrow. It's going to be like an hour and a half, 2 hours. It's fdntraining.com/geeky. You can just find that in the chat because I want to leave Whitney's website up. So that's fdntraining.com/geeky, like a geeky workshop. If you are on audio, unfortunately, that workshop is passed. I apologize. We do have a few questions here. Here we go. Thank
Yeah.
you, everyone. We have Beachy Hair, great YouTube name there.
Yeah.
On the wheat zoomer, would the client need to be eating wheat? Actually, I'll share this for you. Would the client need to be eating wheat and gluten in order for the celiac markers to show up? And let me see if I can get our faces here. There we go. They'd rather
Yes.
see you than me.
Yeah. The answer is yes. And that's true for any IgG, IgA food sensitivity panel. You have to be eating the foods in order for the immune system to react to them. But I run a wheat zoomer on everyone that is my client, even those people who come to me and say, I've been gluten free for 10 years,
Mhm.
because 90% of the time there's something sneaking through their defenses and they don't know because they're not getting exposed at the level that's high enough to provoke obvious symptoms that they associate with getting glutened, right? But they're getting exposed enough to initiate an immune response and to provoke leaky gut and kind of get that ball rolling, right? So yes, you have to be eating it, but I still run it on folks who tell me they're not.
I was about to say, because this is a very interesting point, Beachy Hair. Let's specify something here. So I might walk around thinking that I'm gluten free. And
Right.
unfortunately, just because I travel a lot and I do eat out when I travel, I've accepted that, yes, I probably have gotten cross contaminated a few times while traveling, so at least a few times. So you could have someone that maybe traveled a month ago, got gluten, has been perfect since then. And in theory, aren't there certain markers on the wheat zoomer that could show that you got exposed, even though it was a month ago?
Yeah, so that's that distinction of IgA versus IgG, right? If someone only has IgG reactions, then the story you can tell yourself is, okay, if you live in a gluten-free house and you live alone, chances are you're getting exposed when you dine out. You go to a friend's house, you go to a restaurant, you probably got exposed within the last couple of months, and we're seeing the residual of that. Okay. All right. That's one story. But if someone lives in a house where people are still bringing gluten into the kitchen, then you have to make, room for the reality that you might be getting exposed consistently. You just happen to be safe in the couple of weeks prior to the blood draw, because those IgA antibodies are only showing you what they are exposed to like in the previous 10 days or so,
Yeah.
right? So if someone comes back with both reactions, IgA and IgG, then you can kind of say, yeah, you know what, you're being consistently exposed, right?
Awesome.
Because you got
Thank you.
because you got both. Hmm.
Rihanna. Oh, actually, it's not Rihanna. If this is the same one, I apologize because you are Rihanna then, if I have the same person here. So forgive me. Rihanna asked, is it possible to quickly review that wheat germ/slash thyroid piece? Also, so nice to see your face, Whitney. Thanks for your knowledge on the FDN modules as well as right now. I'm guessing this is a training. So very cool.
Thanks, Brianna. Um, yeah, so wheat germ. Wheat germ is the lectin of wheat. It's kind of like the big bad lectin of all the plant lectins. It's really hard on the gut lining. It can break down the gut lining and kind of cause a leaky gut. And then when it gets through the bloodstream, it can attach to almost every tissue in the body except two. And it really loves the thyroid. When it attaches, let's say, to your thyroid, the immune system sees it, knows it doesn't belong, starts to go after it to get rid of it. And then the surrounding thyroid tissue will get damaged in the process. Now you're off to the races with an autoimmune thyroid disease. Hopefully that answers your question. That's what you were hoping to get.
Okay. AHB. That's just their YouTube name, so that's what comes up. How long does IgG last in the blood? I guess, sorry, we kind of already touched on this. You want to say
Yeah,
it one more time?
it's a couple of months. Yep, yep, a couple of months.
Oh,
It varies, but basically, they start to form, they peak, and then they start to decline. So you never know where you've caught it on the blood draw. Am I at the peak or am I at the end? So you can't really assess how intense someone's reaction was. It's just a snapshot in time. But in general, you're talking 2 or 3 months. IgG antibodies will stick around.
I have a quick question, and I see your other one, AHB, so don't worry. And by the way, I know I always sound like a teacher when I'm doing this, like when we're in grade school, guys, but I have to ask, could we just please, if you liked it, drop a thank you in the chat for Whitney, because
Uh-huh.
they got other things to do. I promise you this. This is more something that they just support us with. And it does take time to prep for these, no matter how many times they've reviewed these labs. Obviously, there is thought that goes into it. So if we could just drop a thank you, and that lets us know that you want to see more content like this. Whitney, a question I had that I can imagine someone's going to watch later or listen later, and they're going to think this and then be like, dang, I wish I got her. Glutenese. There's other products that are supposedly for if you got exposed to gluten or you're going to get exposed to gluten, you might take it before you eat out. What's the validity of those? Is it worth it? Does it actually protect you? What do you think?
So if you're gluten sensitive, anytime you go to a friend's house or you go to a restaurant, anytime you don't make it yourself or you're unsure, always take either Glutenza, Wheat Rescue. I take both. So I'll put a capsule of each in a little baggie. I'll go
Hmm.
off to the restaurant and I'll take them both with that meal. I just assume that I'm going to get some level of a nano exposure, but it doesn't protect you from the immune activation, right? It's not like a force field, right? It's going to help um, kind of super digest or super break down this complex protein that is gluten. It'll also help with dairy because these are just very inflammatory proteins. So it makes it a little bit easier on the gut. So you're going to get a little less inflammation. Perhaps you're going to have a shorter recovery time from the exposure, but it's not a get out of jail free card.
Okay, fair
Yeah.
enough. All right, AHB, another question from them. And I see the thank yous rolling in. Thank you guys, because that just makes the speakers feel good and it helps us know what you want. Which two systems does wheat germ not attach to?
I should have this in my brain. I don't know. I don't keep that in my brain.
It's okay.
There's just so many tissues it does attach to, right? But it definitely goes to the thyroid. It goes to the breast. It goes to the prostate. It goes to the joints. It goes to the connective tissue. I mean, it goes to the pancreas. There's a strong correlation between celiac disease and type 1 diabetes. So I will look that up at some point and I will post it somewhere for you, Evan, but
I know
I don't
Whitney well enough
remember.
to know she is going to go figure that out, and she will never not have that answer again. That's just how she is. There's a
There you
lot in
go.
that brain. Very cool. So Stephanie asked, "Where can I see this replay?" This is always a good thing to share. And sorry, Stephanie, I should do this every time. People don't realize that when we're doing this live on YouTube or Facebook, first of all, you can rewind it right now if you wanted to. Second, this is automatically available for replay at any time the second that we're off here. So if you're on our Facebook page, just go to those videos or our feed. You'll see it right away. If you're on YouTube, what tricks people up is this actually is under the live tab, not the video tab, because we streamed it. So as soon as we're done here, you can watch this whole thing again, save it for later, whatever you want to do. I will wait another few seconds to see if there is any last minute questions. Whitney, I'll throw this at you because we
Yeah.
talked about morgannutrition.com. I know that you could help a variety of people, but just for those listening, who are your favorite people to work with so that if they're in the audience at any point and they're like, all right, dang, I don't know. Like, should I reach out to her? I think they get nervous. Who's your favorite type of person to work with? Do they have to have celiac or could it be any autoimmune stuff?
Any autoimmune issues at all, primarily Hashimoto's, because it's just so common. But most of my clients have a cluster of autoimmune issues. So yeah, autoimmunity in general. And I tend to like to work with um, women who are more in the middle age zone,
Mhm.
and those who are really willing to do the work and make the changes necessary to get their health back. So
Fair enough.
I'm very much a data nerd. I'm kind of I guess a bit of a hard ass when it comes to
You?
coaching. Yeah, right.
No.
I mean, I've got compassion up the yin yang, but only for people who are willing to do the work, right?
Yeah.
So if you're the kind of person that'll say, "Oh, I'll do anything but," I'm not your gal, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah, yeah. But
Ulcerative colitis, Stephanie asked, so I'm guessing that's
yeah,
something that you probably. Yep. Awesome.
yeah, absolutely. And one thing I just wanted to kind of end with, if I
Sure.
could, Evan,
Sure.
is that I said when I pitched this idea to you, if I could only run two tests on someone, these are the two tests that I would run. And the reason for that is because the gut is so critical to everything that's going on systemically, right? As goes the gut, so goes the rest of the body. And autoimmune issues are becoming the greatest health issue of our time right now. And so if we're not dealing with the gut, we're missing the whole opportunity to kind of turn this around
Mhm.
for people. And these two tests, because wheat is such an adverse has such an adverse impact on gut health, it is one of those dominoes that sets up the microbiome for extreme imbalance, right? So I think it's really important to see both of these things together. That's why I would start with this. If this was all I could do, this would be where I would go.
Awesome. I
Yeah.
just appreciate your work so much, especially for people like my mom and I. I mean, I watched her. It took 7 years for her to get diagnosed with Graves' disease, let alone
Yeah.
the interesting. We won't get into this, but the interesting things that happened after the diagnosis. So the amount of people out there that are suffering with this stuff. I mean, you say the word cancer, and people immediately they feel sorry and they take it seriously, as they should, by the way.
Sure.
But autoimmune, there's so much disconnect that I
Mhm.
don't think people often understand what these individuals go through and their suffering. So to have
Yeah.
people out there like you that are just like warriors and champions for them, educating people and helping them, we absolutely love that and appreciate it. One last thing, just so people are clear on something. I never want these lab and learns to get misinterpreted as, oh my gosh, look at how great Whitney is. Look at how great Paula is or Dr. Gonshore. I can't go do what they do. One, they're clinical advisors for a reason, right? Your client doesn't need to know that you booked in with Whitney to get some help. My clients
Nope.
don't know that. Actually, in fact, they don't know the specifics, but I often tell them that when they hire me, they're hiring a team of minds, and I will
Mhm.
go and use those minds if I need to, if I don't have the answers. I think they appreciate that. But two, let's also disclaim something. Your bio was very impressive. You got a million certifications, but how long have you been a clinical advisor? Because I almost want to say you've been a clinical advisor as long as I've been an FDN.
Yeah, I think I started clinical advising in 2016,
Okay,
maybe.
so yeah, you were a clinical
Yeah.
advisor a year before I even started the FDN
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
So guys, there's levels to it, and it's okay. There's plenty of clientele that will work with you fresh out of the FDN course. And then if you want to take this super advanced, this is the type of people that you have in the community to learn from. So we will see you guys next week with actually, sorry, 2 weeks from now with another Lab and Learn. We got a special thing that we're working on for that. And then since you guys loved Whitney so much, we will make sure to get her back in the cycle here. It might be a couple months or a few months before we have the same people recurring. But if you guys like it and they're getting good results from it, I don't think they would have any opposition to coming back, correct?
Awesome. I love it. Yeah.
Sweet.